Okay, welcome AP World History students. Chapter 26. This is Africa and the Atlantic world. Okay. All right, as you can see here on the map, gives you a description of the Songhai Empire, the Kingdom of Congo, and I can't even read the bottom one. Sorry. Uh, yeah, sorry. All right, move on from that. All right, states of West Africa and East Africa. Basically, this PowerPoint, this section is going over some African history ranging from the 8th to the 16th centuries. A little bit of it may be some review. The Kingdom of Ghana, major gold trader, not related to the modern state of Ghana. Of course, you got the Mali Empire. You remember them well under Mansa Musa, one of those Western African empires that, um, were a product of the Trans-Saharan Trade Network. Then you get the Songhai Empire in the 15th century, high point under Sunni Ali, as you can imagine, a Muslim empire, created an effective army and navy, and the musket-bearing Moroccan army destroyed the Songhai forces. Morocco is a northern African nation. They were Muslims a long, long time before Songhai were, and they come in and they exert local control there. Swahili, always think of the Swahili as being in the eastern part of Africa. Remember that the Portuguese are sailing around Africa in their journey to get to India, especially under Vasco da Gama. He was the first to do so. So he's going to have some skirmishes with Swahili Africans. In 1502, his forces return and they force Kilwa, an African city, to pay them tribute. And in 1505, just 3 years later, the Portuguese gunships would end up dominating Swahili ports. So this is kind of the beginning of European imperialization in Africa. Now, the Kingdom of Congo, more centrally located, relations with Portuguese began in about 1483, so pretty early. King Nzinga Mimimba, white people called him Afonso I. He converted to Catholicism. So Africa, which has been a mixture of native shamanist religions, and of course the huge Muslim impact, is now getting impacted with Christianity as well. Again, like it does in other cases, it's useful for them to convert to Catholicism because it helps them in their trading relations with the Portuguese traders. Now, King Nzinga was a very zealous convert. He, really took to the religion and attempted to convert the entire population, with mixed results there. There's a picture of the King of Congo and European ambassadors. Now, slave raiding, we're getting into kind of the meat, the heart of this. Initially, the Portuguese have their own attempts at slave trading, but they realized that it's a lot easier just to trade weapons to Africans for slaves. So what you have here is that other African tribes will raid other African tribes, and then they'll take prisoners of war, sell them as slaves to Portuguese traders, and they'll get guns in exchange, and the guns will give them an advantage in warfare and will make it easier for them to take slaves. Congo kings eventually, however, realize that this is not a good thing, and they try to slow the trade down. They don't want to end it because it's still profitable. They're still thinking about themselves first, but they don't want it as much as it is, basically. So they're trying to slow the trading down, but that's not going to work. The genie's out of the bottle at this point. So relationships deteriorate between the Portuguese and the Congo. The Portuguese attack and end up killing the king by cutting his head off in 1665. You also get bigger slave markets developing in the South. So this is the setup. The English and other European countries are going to basically, take the Portuguese model and begin taking African slaves. All right, Kingdom of Ngongo, modern day Angola. Ndongo gains wealth and independence from Congo by means of the Portuguese slave trade. But the Portuguese influence was resisted by Queen Nzinga. Now, she's interesting because she kind of like Hatshepsut in Egypt. She basically pretends to be a man. She has male concubines, but they're dressed like women. And, she's, have a beard and that kind of stuff, fake beard and whatnot, and pretend to be a man. She established her temporary alliance with the Dutch, not the Portuguese now. The Dutch are getting involved in an unsuccessful attempt to expel the Portuguese. She's hoping to play the Dutch against the Portuguese. And after she dies, the kingdom of Ndongo is going to decline. Now, regional kingdoms, when we talk about Africa, it seems like we're usually talking about regional kingdoms. These chieftains developed trade with the Swahili city-states. We've talked about Great Zimbabwe before. 20,000 people is one of their largest cities. The Dutch built Cape Town at the very tip of southern Africa in 1652, which increased involvement with southern African politics. So they're getting involved in them. British colonies are also beginning to develop here in Africa. Africa has become a place of opportunity for Europeans and a sort of a cash cow and a big, important piece of the puzzle when it comes to New World ambitions from the Europeans. Now, Islam in sub-Saharan Africa. Remember, they're paganists, they're shamans, they're witch doctors, ancestor worship before the Muslims arrive. But that commercial centers would develop around Islam, big trading centers. Timbuktu, Western Africa, becomes this enormous major center of Islamic scholarship by the 16th century. So a learned institution that's going to help push out Islam into Africa. African traditions and beliefs, remember, as always, blend with Islam. African Islam does not look like Middle Eastern Islam. Some of the difference, of course, are the gender relations, which are much more lax in Africa than they are in the Middle East, where it's kept more separate. And female modesty, you would see bare-breasted women in Africa, where you would certainly not see that in the Middle East. You get the Fulani. And the Fulani are fundamentalist, if you will. Their movement is to make African Muslims like Middle Eastern Muslims. And so they're, use force to try to enforce Sharia law in West Africa. They have some success, but for the most part, Africa is going to keep their Islam a little separate from Middle Eastern. All right, but Christianity in sub-Saharan Africa, it is also syncretic, meaning that Christianity in Africa looks a little bit different than Christianity in Europe. You have a movement you should know, the Antonian movement, which flourished in the 1700s. And it's founded by a woman named Donna Beatrice, who she basically claims that she's been possessed by St. Anthony and that Jesus was a black man and that Congo's the Holy Land, not Jerusalem, and heaven for Africans. So she's taking Christian religion and she's making it African-based, if you will. As you can imagine, European Christians are not very happy at this, and they persuade King Pedro IV of the Congo to burn Donna Beatrice at the stake for being a witch and a heretic. So her end is not very good. Now, her movement does survive her a little bit, but eventually they'll all become more Orthodox Christians. All right. Social change. Trade with Europeans brought in new goods to Africa. That's very important. It brings them things they'd never seen before. You get new crops from the Americas. Manioc becomes staple bread flour, which is going to help with population growth as well. Even though they're losing large numbers of Africans to the slave trade, their population is still booming because of food brought in from the New World. Here you can see the steady increase in population over a 300-year span, almost uniform. It's not a spike. It is just a steady growth. Now, African slavery is different. We've talked about slavery from the very first day of class, essentially. We know that slavery has always existed, typically in the form of prisoners of war or debtors, people who owe money. African slavery is different. Now, it's been there forever, but it's been like, in the same form that the rest of the world practice it. But now it's going to be different. Now, in the beginnings of this, what you see is no private property. Therefore, wealth was defined by human labor potential, not land. So in Africa, when they were taking slaves, wealthy people had a lot of slaves. And that was kind of how their wealth was counted, but these slaves often assimilated into the owner's clan. They became basically part of their family. And remember that a slave owner's children or a slave's children were not slaves like they will be in the European form of slavery. The Muslims were the first ones to expand the slave trade, and new slaves acquired were acquired by raiding villages. They were sold on the Swahili coast, which is closer to the Middle East, and Arab traders depended on African infrastructure to maintain the supply. Basically, they're depending on Africans to trade other Africans to them. The European demand on the West Coast, now we're switching from the East Coast, where the Muslims were doing most of their trading, to the West Coast, which is closer to the New World, causes the demand to rise again for slaves. Here's a picture of an Arab slave trader. Now, Portuguese raided West African coast in 1441. That's very early. Remember, that's before Columbus. That's before Bartholomew Diaz and Vasco da Gama do their explorations. So it's going to be Northern Africa, Northwest Africa. They take 12 men. They're met with stiff resistance. They basically kidnap these people. But there's economy. It's about money. African dealers become ready to provide slaves. They realize that they can get something out of this. In 1460, 500 slaves per year were sold to work as miners, porters, domestic servants in Spain and Portugal, which are pretty close in proximity. By 1520, 2,000 slaves per year are taken to work in sugarcane plantations in the Americas. And this is where it jumps into this enormous slave trade that you're probably familiar with. And 2,000 years is going to grow exponentially. Sugar is a tough product, and the sugar slaves are going to be worked almost essentially to death. And here's a graphic of slaves at working in a mine. Very tough, brutal job. All right, now this is a must know. The triangular trade, and it's pretty simple. European manufactured goods, especially guns, get sent to Africa. So what does Africa do? Africa, to get those guns, Africa is going to enslave other Africans. They're going to sell them to the Europeans, who send them to the Americas, where they work on plantations to produce cash crops. And goods in America are going to return to Europe, which will then start the whole process over. Trade Africa firearms and stuff, and Africa will give them slaves, and the slaves will be sent to America to work in plantations with cash crops. That's the triangular trade. You can see it here very clearly. Areas of slave trade here. Europeans taking, and then slaves coming over to Brazil. This is sugar. Up here will be tobacco and cotton. Okay, and that's the triangle trade. You must know it. The triangle trade is also under the umbrella of the Atlantic slave trade. And this is the 300 period shot right here of the Atlantic slave trade. Yeah. All right. Now, in the triangle trade, there is the part of it that goes from Africa to the Americas is the most infamous. It's called the Middle Passage, and you must know it as well. Very simple. The Middle Passage is incredibly horrific conditions. The journey has sped up from Columbus's initial 3-month voyage with knowledge of winds and things like that. We get a 4 to 6 week brutal journey to the New World. In the beginning, the mortality rate was, up to 50%. Half the slaves that went on the ship would end up dying before they ever reached the Americas. Eventually, that number declines to 5%. In the beginning, there were times, the Africans are slaved together in the holds of cramped in these ships. The ships aren't huge. Remember, they're not enormous ships. So they're trying to pack as many slaves on there as possible. They're chained together. Under there, they will have to use the bathroom on themselves, urinate and defecate. When one gets sick, that sickness is spread to the others. There was even a stat that said, they would be taken up on deck and washed once a week. And some of the slaves would take that opportunity to jump off into the ocean and commit suicide rather than continue in the conditions that they had been in. Total slave traffic in the 300-year period is approximately 12 million, with 4 million of those dying before they ever make it to the New World. So just horrific and staggering numbers. So remember that this is a type of slavery that has never been seen before. Here, very simple, as people realize that slaves can make, and remember, there's two things here. They can make an enormous amount of money off of slaves coming to the New Worlds working on plantations. But remember also that Native Americans are dying in too high of numbers. Africans and Europeans have been in contact for thousands and thousands of years, and so they have, more immunity towards these diseases of each other. And so because the Indians made poor slaves, that seals the deal for Africans who are going to basically, support the workforce over in the New World. Impact on African religions. There you get a benefit from distance from the slave ports on the western coast. Other societies benefited from the slave trade profit. Basically, you have some Africans who are, making out at the expense of like interior tribes and stuff. These are their enemies. These are tribes and groups that they've been raiding for thousands of years and whatnot. But eventually they are going to see the very negative consequences for the continent of Africa, for their role, their part that they play in the slave trade. There are a lot of social effects, and that's what I'm talking about here. Total African population expands because of those American crops, but millions of captured Africans are going to be removed from the society. And mostly those are going to be because the ones that sell for the most amount of money are the warriors, the men, because the men could do more work than the women out on these sugar plantations, these hard jobs and stuff. So you get a gender distortion. You get a sex ratio that isn't good. 2/3 of slaves were male between the age of 14 and 35 years of age, so prime years. So what happens is basically that in Africa, something that had never existed, polygamy, having more than one husband or wife, basically takes place. And so the women are forced to, you have a man with two wives because there simply isn't enough men to go around. And so this is a massive social effect on Africa because of the slave trade. There are political effects as well. The introduction of firearms increased the violence. So you've always had these conflicts with these tribes raiding each other, but because of guns, you get, they're more bold, I suppose, especially when they have the guns and the tribe that they're attacking doesn't. That makes them very bold. More weapons, more slaves, more weapons. It's all connected. Most slaves in tropical and came from tropical and subtropical regions. The first plantation was established in Hispaniola, 1516, so not long after Columbus, 2 decades basically. This will spread, of course, into Mexico, Brazil, the Caribbean, and the Americas. Sugar was the most lucrative cash crop, but tobacco, rice, indigo, cotton, and coffee will all be cash crops in their own right. And like I said, the plantations are heavily dependent on slave labor, and you get racial divisions of labor as well. All right, destinations, where are the slaves going? 50% of them are going to the Caribbean, and 33% of them are going to Brazil, 12% are going to Central and South America, and only 5% are going to North America. We are Americans, of course, so we think of the slave trade being centered on us, but it really wasn't because we had less sugar. Ours was more cotton and tobacco, which weren't as profitable as sugar. So the majority of the slaves are going to those other areas. Also, in the Americas, our slavery was a little easier than what slavery was on the other places. So less slaves were dying. And so you had a lot more families of slaves growing in North America. So basically, slave owners might buy 10 slaves initially. Maybe they buy 5 girls, 5 guys, and they're going to have families. And the slave owner is going to have more slaves because of that. And they're not going to have to import them from Africa. Regional differences, like I said, the Caribbean and South America, there's more diseases there. Malaria and yellow fever. The mosquitoes are a lot worse there. brutal working conditions, very poor. Sanitation's bad. They're not fed good. There's a major gender imbalance where the vast majority of them in the Caribbean and South America are men. So they constantly have to import slaves. I've read somewhere where the average lifespan for a slave there was only 21 years of age. So they are being used, abused, and discarded. In North America, you had less of these tropical diseases, the more normal sex ratio, so it's closer to 50%. Slave families were encouraged as prices rose in the 18th century. Slaves are expensive, so it makes more sense to balance your slaves and allow them to create families for themselves and for the slave owner. Now, there's of course resistance to slavery. In there's only one successful slave rebellion in the Americas, and that's the Haitian Revolution later on. There are none successful in North America, but there are other ways that slaves resist. One of them is they just don't work very hard. They're not going to give their master their hardest work. It's one of the few ways that they can resist sabotage. It's one of the reasons that the South in America, the Southern states, did not invest in new technology because they knew the slaves would break it. So they stayed. The South kind of stayed backwards, which will affect them in the Civil War and be a major reason they lose. There were slaves that escaped, and sometimes these slaves would escape and form like I don't call it civilizations, but groups called Maroons out in the mountains and stuff like that. And you would have revolts, but again, the revolts are going to be put down. As I said, only one successful slave revolt. That was the Haitian Revolution, 1793. They are heavily influenced by the American Revolution of 1776. Everywhere else, though, they're going to be outgunned by Euro-American firepower. I mean, the Haitians were led by Toussaint L'Ouverture, who some people called the Black George Washington. He's influenced by the Enlightenment, just like our founding fathers were. They're influenced by the American Revolution. Also, France is at this time going through some stuff. They're going through the French Revolution back home, so it's good timing for them. All right, African American culture. There's a lot of diversity of these African cultures. The white people see them as all black people, but they're coming in from all these different tribes from Africa. So this is all going to blend. And in the beginning, many of them spoke either their native African tongue or Arabic, but they're going to be taught English, as you can imagine. For the ones in North America, African languages when numbers permitted, otherwise European language adapted with African influence. You got Creole languages and stuff like that, just depending on where you were at. Christianity was adapted to incorporate African traditions. In the beginning, the English did not, the slave owners did not worry too much about converting Africans to Christianity. Later on, there becomes a movement, however, and so then it becomes a slave owner's duty to teach his slaves about God, and the slaves are going to take that Christianity and adapt it in their own way. Whereas while they're still big on Jesus, Moses, who freed his people from slavery, has an enormous impact in African Christian society. So they're going to take Christianity and make it a little bit of their own. Working towards abolition, getting rid of slavery. It's an enormous. It's the first half of American history next year when we talk about and when we get to APUSH. Aloda Equiano is one of the most famous. He was a former slave who learned how to read and write, and he sells his autobiography, and he attacks the institution of slavery very eloquently in it. It's going to help convince people that slavery is a horrific tradition. Also, another thing that is going to move towards getting rid of slaves is that the cost of them rise. It simply becomes too expensive to own them. It's costing money to prevent rebellions. 18th century, the price of sugar falls and the price of slaves rise. Again, that's part of it. So in America, you're going to see, like in Virginia, that some of the plantation owners basically allow their slaves to buy their freedom because they can't really afford as many slaves as they have. They have to let them go. All right, wage labor becomes more efficient. Wage earners can spend income on manufactured goods. And there's more than one type of slavery. There's gang labor slavery and there's task system slavery. Task system slavery was a lot better. There were actually slaves in North America who their masters let them work, 3 to 5 acres and have their own like little cabins. They could go fishing when their work was done. Not to make slavery sound like it was a good thing, because it wasn't, but there were different levels of slavery. Gang labor slavery is more for cotton. That was work from sun up to sundown, unless there was a full moon, then you work till midnight. So it's pretty bad. All right, into slave trade eventually comes. Denmark abolishes slave trade in 1803. Britain is close behind in 1807. The United States in 1808 bans the importation of slaves. There's no more buying slaves from Africa. However, slavery will exist in the United States until the Civil War, and 1865 frees them. France bans theirs in 1814. The Netherlands in 1817, and eventually Spain in 1845. 1867, it's still kind of happening. You get sort of black market smuggling of slaves. And eventually, 1888, you get the last of it in Brazil. Saudi Arabia and Angola continue into the 1960s in kind of a weird little smaller scale slave trade. Okay, guys, that is it. This chapter focuses on Africa's role in the slave trade, how it happened, the consequences of the slave trade on African society, the economic motives for why the South Atlantic slave system happened. So keep all those things in mind. Not a lot of names to remember, so that's helpful. You should be able to pick up the theme of this chapter.